This is Main Street on Prairie Public. I'm Ashley Thornburg, and today we are going to honor the legacy of the late Bob Dambach. He was our former director of television. He rose through the ranks here at Prairie Public, joining us first in 1985 as he served as our program manager, then an associate manager of broadcast services, and finally to our director of television. He passed away on Friday, January 21st, following some issues with his health. And we are going to talk about his legacy today with Prairie Public producer Matt O'Lean. Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Ashley, for having me.
And we also have Michael Miller. He was one of the executive producers on a number of programs that our television service put out, namely the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ashley.
Michael, we'll start with you. When did you first meet Bob?
I first met Bob back in actually it was 1994 when I met Bob at Prairie Public when after some of us had gone over to Odessa, Ukraine to investigate the idea of offering what we call Journey to the Homeland tours for people to visit their ancestral villages in southern Ukraine. And so then when I came back, I told Bob that I think we should pursue this idea. So then in 1995, we announced these Homeland tours, and they were so popular so that the first tour, actually there were two tours, in May of 1996, and that's the first tour that we took. And so Dave Keck, as a videographer, and Bob Dambach, as a producer, joined us for both tours. And so Bob actually joined the tours in 1996, 1997, and 1998, and then later, too, that we just traveled into. Because he wanted to visit Germany and Ukraine, or Germany and Alsace, France for filming. So that's how it all started. And then what happened was, from the filming that they did develop the first television documentary called The Germans from Russia, Children of the Steppe and Children of the Prairie. That really was a stepping stone, I think, for Prairie Public and for prairie folks in knowing about who are these Germans from Russia. It really became a national success story.
Yeah. Well, and there are so many programs that have developed out of that theme of celebrating that heritage. Michael, it seemed to me that his passion for that project never waned. He was always excited to be doing something on the Germans from Russia.
Well, it's so interesting. I was thinking about what could I share about Bob, but I remember in 1999, after February of 1999, when the Children of the Steppe premiered at Prairie Public, and then it was so popular, so they showed it at South Dakota Broadcasting, and so Bob drove down to Vermilion, South Dakota. But on the way back from Sioux Falls, he was driving, and he called me up and he said, the most popular part of that documentary is the food. People love that food.
Yeah.
And I remember the lady from Wishing they filmed. And so then developed rather quickly. We filmed later in 1999, and lo and behold, in the fall of 2000, Prairie Public premiered Schmeckfest Food Traditions of the Germans from Russia. Mm-hmm. And that probably is one of the most successful of all of them to show on PBS stations because people love the foods. It had such a good relationship to the East Europeans. So that was very popular on the East Coast and in the Midwest.
Yeah. Matt, it's easy for us to think of him as, kind of a larger-than-life personality here at Prairie Public, but he really had a national presence. Can you help provide a little context here about what programming like this, when it goes on to the national level, why is that so important? What does that really mean?
Yeah, he was very good at at making sure these programs got seen around the country, especially in areas with a high, German population, Germans from Russia population. So he really was a groundbreaker in that for Prairie Public. And then, so I was brought on in 1998. So I worked for Bob for 20 years till his retirement in 2018. And the thing I want to share about Bob is he really gave me – I was burnt out on commercial news. I was a news reporter at KXJB for 9 years. And as you know, Ashley, there's a burnout in that field.
I didn't make it 9
almost
years.
Everybody leaves at some point. And so he gave me this opportunity to come on and host Plains Talk, which was a talk show, which is kind of now morphed into Prairie Pulse. But once I was here, I kind of presented this documentary idea about Class B basketball. And he, just kind of let me do it. He trusted that I was going to go find the people to be interviewed, find all the footage. There was no funding for it, but he thought it was a good idea. And I think Michael will second this. Bob really loved sharing the history of this region with people. And we had the opportunity to do long-form documentaries on whether it's the Germans from Russia or Class B basketball. And so he really, I think, gave me a chance to do that. I'd never dreamed of doing a documentary like that. And he trusted my artistic instincts to go out and get it done and do it in the right way. So that was really something he gave me that I can never repay.
I worked on just one small section of Prairie Mosaic once, and I don't work for the television department. I work in radio, and at the time I was even in the development department, but I had also come, like you, Matt, from a commercial television background. And it was very similar. He let me work on this project, trusted me to do the research, to go and ask the right questions, and then I helped on the editing process. And then after this first round, Barb Gravel, who is now the production manager at Prairie Public, and Bob Dambach came in. They proofed this, and what really stands out to me is that he watched this, didn't take any notes whatsoever, but was able to provide this feedback that was really detailed and just things that were like, oh, if you put this part of the story, first. So I want to talk about just the skill set that he brings, because to put something on the air, you have to have this combination of perfectionism, but also, that trusting of someone to put it on the air. But let's go through that level of what can sometimes be struggled to be called perfectionism, but that level of you need to have somebody who really makes you do the work.
Yep. He was Mr. Quality Control in post-production. I think of all the things I can say about Bob, and Michael can, I'm sure, chime in sitting in edit bays with Bob watching shows, that was his genius, was coming in an edit bay with no notes, no nothing, and he would watch an hour-long documentary, and then it was like a jigsaw puzzle. Matt, why don't you put the Ed Beyer segment from Class B, that's the first time he ever said this to me, here, and it'll move this here. And I was like, no, you can't touch my baby. But in the end, he was right. He was almost always right, Michael, when he would move that jigsaw puzzle around and say, this soundbite should be here, this should be here, and he would do it without any notes. And it was sometimes frustrating because he would move your show around. But in the end, don't you agree, Michael? His expertise was almost always right. Don't you think, Michael?
Yes. I remember most recently the final documentary that Bob was involved with was Women Behind the Plow, which was also a huge success. That was in 2019. And I remember how many times I came to Prairie Public and the editing was, and then Carmen Rathwald and Acacia Jonas Stuckel came to Fargo, and they also were part of the editing because the Tri-County Tourism License was one of the financial partners for that documentary. But, I mean, how many times we went through this and how many times we changed. The most difficult part was that all these good segments that we filmed we couldn't include in the document.
Yeah.
That was very difficult because some of the people and the women were expecting to be included. And that was very difficult for Bob to because you have only, it's a 1-hour documentary and not even 60 minutes. And so that was a challenge. But I think that the quality and the excellence certainly shined with the response to these television documentaries.
Well, he traveled all over the world to put together television programs that aired on Prairie Public and aired nationally. It's hard to travel with other people, especially when it's a coworker and you can't just be like, hey, husband, get out of my way. So let's talk about some good travel stories. Matt, you've been to South Korea with him. Michael, you've been to I don't even know how many different countries with Bob. So I guess I'll just start with, what's the first story that comes to your mind as a quintessential travel with Bob?
Well, Bob and I traveled, of course, many times to Ukraine, but we also traveled to Russia, to Alsace, France, Germany, of course. But the most exciting, I think, was the time when Bob and I actually went for a pre-filming to go to Argentina and Brazil. This was in 2012, and then again, the actual filming and the interviews was in 2013. And 2013, in September, Barb Gravel joined us to Argentina. But that was the most challenging because each trip required three weeks of travel, because Argentina and Brazil are such large countries. And so that was challenging for Bob, sometimes with his health, but he persevered. But it was amazing. I was so fortunate because I could speak the German language, because many times these interviews were actually in German. So that helped a lot. But, it was just intriguing. For us, it was the interest in the comparison to life on the prairies in the Dakotas and life especially in Argentina on the steppe that looked so much like much of North Dakota. But to me, that was the most memorable, probably, the trips to Argentina and Brazil.
I didn't travel as much with Bob because he would have his documentaries, I would have mine. But yeah, South Korea was 2005. We went with an NDSU group over there. And I would say Bob was, I'm sure Michael will say this, he was always in pretty good spirits on trips. He liked to travel. He liked to eat good food. And he was just, I always thought he was a little more relaxed on the road. Didn't you, Michael?
At times, yes, yeah. But it depended on how long you were there. It was a challenge for us when you're with people for 3 weeks. But generally speaking, I think we certainly were welcomed by these people, and often we were having meals in the homes of these people. And so it was very interesting. And that's when I really appreciate growing up in Strasbourg, knowing the German language, because often I would have to be the translator, if someone wasn't there for Spanish or Portuguese.
And Bob, he had this, again, genius for finding these programs, like with the ERC in Grand Forks. I did a lot of long shoots with them as well. He would find these projects and get funding for them, and the next thing you know, we're flying to Texas or Washington State or Florida or Argentina or India or Africa. These are all places he went on trips with various producers and videographers and whatnot. And so he was really good at grant writing, really good at finding something, saying this would be a great documentary, but then he would say to the people, whether it's Devil's Lake flooding or over in India or EERC, carbon sequestration, can you find the funding for this? And invariably they would. And the next thing you know, we were off shooting documentaries. So he really found documentaries all over the world, literally, for us to go shoot in this station in Fargo, North Dakota.
Yeah, you think with someone with such an artistic mindset of being able to produce television, to have that kind of business angle, too, of you had to be good at getting the money. I'll share an anecdote. I never traveled with Bob for work, but I did occasionally be on television with him. And when I first started here, I was in my early 20s. I didn't have that much experience on TV, and I was very afraid of Bob. Like I said, he had this big personality. And my first real experience with him was it was kind of a high-stress situation, and let's just say I ended up being very afraid of him. But then I was on the air with him, and it was snap the finger different, and immediately on air, he had this ability to connect with the viewers, to connect with the programming. You really get a sense, Michael, that he truly believed in anything that he was putting out on the air.
Yes, yeah. Well, even Bob, even with his retirement, Bob and I have been working on 2 documentaries that, so my vision is that we need to complete these documentaries with Prairie Public in memory of Bob. And one is he would like to have seen a documentary on the Welk Homestead State Historic Site. That's such an important, from a different viewpoint than just about Lawrence Welk. Yeah. And the other documentary that we had talked about is after I had been to Kansas, and that is to do a Prairie Public documentary on the story of the Volga German foods and the foodways of the Volga Germans, because that's so different than their foods in North Dakota, the Black Sea Germans. So he would like to do that, and both of them are in progress. COVID has put us at kind of at a stalemate, but I think that both Bob, the last time I saw him, we talked about both of these documentaries, and he said, I'd like to see you get these done. So we'll see what happens.
I want to just spend the last few minutes here talking about his legacy, because somebody who has 35 years in television production, and that's just at Prairie Public. He worked in television for a long time before that, too. Matt, how do you think his legacy will be remembered?
I think for me, it's the attention to detail that we're not putting anything on the air that isn't great and that hasn't been watched 3, 4, 5, 6 times. I mean, your eyes would bug out of your head. I would watch these documentaries over and over with him. I knew what soundbite was coming up. It was just, but that's how major movies are edited too. And coming from commercial news, Ashley, it's one story a day. It is smash and grab. It is, we'll interview this person here, even though there's car horns going off and back. And he taught me really how to watch documentaries differently. Audio, quality control. What did the interviews look like? Why is that mic cord hanging out? That was not allowed under a Bob production. Things like that. So that's his legacy for me, is the quality of the product he put on the air. And he was a great Pledge Drive guy, too. I mean, I learned how to be more of a salesman on Pledge Drive by watching him sell that product and telling us to call that phone number.
I think for Bob, I'm in my 55th year at NDSU and will retire in 2022. But Bob leaves a legacy of, he had a vision, I think, when I got involved with him, that he wanted to film the people of North Dakota. And I think that's really important. And I think, in my mind, Prairie Public's a leader nationally throughout the United States. There's no other PBS station that's done all these television documentaries, not only for Germans from Russia, but he did others too. And one of the highlights that I watched recently is called Homesteading. That's a beautiful documentary because it covers many different ethnic groups in North Dakota who homesteaded. So I think Bob leaves a legacy. Thank heavens we can watch these on YouTube and other formats. But for me, he leaves a legacy for North Dakota of us remembering the roots of the people.
Bob Dambach, the late director of television for Prairie Public, passed away on Friday. There will be a celebration of life planned for springtime when people can gather outside. Longtime collaborators Matt O'Lean and Michael Miller, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ashley.
Beautiful.
Dakota Datebook is next.